All right, hello. Welcome to BMA NMWA Here and Now. It's 2021, and our focus today is here and now. With the turn of the year, we kind of think about the past, we think about where we are in the present, and we look to forecast our future. So we thought we would kind of take a moment to think about this particular moment.
Yeah, hi everybody. Nice to be back in 2021. As Veronica said, today's show, Here and Now, is really thinking about the present moment and our space and time. Today's show explores artworks that speak to a moment in time and transform a particular place, artworks that are ephemeral and relational, works that envelop and engage you. Hi, I'm Addie Gayoso from the National Museum of Women in the Arts.
And I'm Veronica Betancourt from the Baltimore Museum of Art. And as always, we are coming to you extremely live. So today we're excited to have two guests joining us. First, we have Virginia Anderson, Curator of American Art from the Baltimore Museum of Art. And just bring her in now. So here we go. Hi, Virginia.
Hi.
It's so nice to have you join us.
It's so nice to be joining you. Thank you for having me.
Hi.
Yeah. And so we wanted to bring you in to talk about an exhibition and also an installation by Caterina Grossa called Is It You? And she always has these sort of poetically inflected titles where you're not entirely sure what it means. With that sort of, flexibility of meaning aside, one of the things that we wanted to do for those of you who have not been able to come to the Baltimore Museum of Art to see the work is to give a little bit of a sense of it. So I'm going to do a little bit of live streaming magic and take us off screen and have a video walkthrough that our digital media manager created to give a sense of Is It You? So let's make great. Oops. There we go. All right. So Virginia, can you still hear us and see us? Or rather hear the video and see us?
I can see the video, although it's not playing yet, but I can hear you. Yes.
All right. Perfect. Well, let's bring us in to Is It You?
There we go.
And I'm just going to start us here.
Very nice. So I guess I can just say that what we're looking at here is a room-sized immersive fabric installation that was designed and created by the German artist Caterina Grossa. And essentially what you're seeing is an enormous knotted sheet of fabric that's been suspended from the trussed ceiling of the BMA's Gallery 8 in our contemporary wing. And then once the piece was essentially kind of put together and sculpted in place, the artist came in and painted it. And it's been painted with using a compressor and a spray gun to apply layers and layers of acrylic paint and create this really, as you can see, just kaleidoscopic, immersive space that viewers can come in and explore.
And Virginia, can you give us a sense of scale here? I mean, because I think it's hard to tell just how vast this thing is.
That's a great question. So the gallery itself is about 2,300 square feet with 25-foot high ceilings. And so it really is, it's the largest gallery in our contemporary wing. And this functions kind of like a bubble in that space, a cloud-like sort of bubble that's in the middle of the room. And that you can enter into. There are 3 points of access, and you can enter into it and you can walk around within it.
Oops. All right. I'm actually gonna, so we did that quick little video walkthrough, and clearly there's more to talk about. So let me bring our PowerPoint up And then we can start talking through some of the process of what it took to actually make this, because it is a really, really sort of vast and complicated work.
Mm-hmm.
And I was so glad to see the video. I had a chance to see it in November, and it just, it felt so, it felt almost like a natural environment, almost like a cavern or some sort of canyon. And I love some of those images of the fabric seeming like to be dripping, almost look like stalactites hanging from the rest of the feature. So I really love seeing those again.
Yeah, I think that's a great comparison, Addie. I think, I was thinking about this in relationship to a painting, actually, that's in our American wing by Thomas Cole that features this sublime landscape, with cliffs and mountains and swirling clouds. And it really does have that landscape kind of feeling, which is so funny given that it is this Technicolor palette. But the way in which the fabric is sculpted, it really evokes landscape features, waterfalls, cliffs. Yeah, totally.
And I've brought up some images of the first half of this temporary exhibition, which includes some of Gross's paintings on canvas that go directly on the wall. And so folks can see that she is constantly playing with really vivid color. But, it takes a very different form than this really sculptural kind of stepping inside of a painting.
Yeah, that's exactly right. I mean, I think in the 2D paintings, she's using color to create a sense of visual optical space. And then with the fabric installations, it really is as if you're being given the opportunity to walk into a painting and explore that three-dimensional sense of space.
Yeah, and we have a question I'm seeing asking that, is this a permanent installation? And though you will see just how physically imposing it is as we keep moving through, it is not permanent. So though the BMA is not currently open, when we are able to reopen, this particular piece will continue to be up. So, if you can make the trip to Baltimore safely, once we're open again, we welcome you to.
That's right. Yeah, the show, the fabric installation component runs through September 19th, 2021. So here's hoping we will all be out and about and able to explore museums before then.
Indeed. And just so that folks can get a closer look, I'm going to take our video off screen and just keep our audio so that we can really dive into this incredibly immersive space. So here we are. Okay, so Virginia, I thought we might hear a little bit more about what it took to have Grossa see the gallery and respond to the space with this, it's almost a painted sculpture. It's almost a sculpted painting. It's at the that liminal zone between the two.
Oh, that's exactly right. Right. So the artist in her studio made a visit to the museum in early 2018, and saw the space. And we gave them obviously very precise measurements, and they took photos. And so they really had a sense of, what the space was that they'd be working with. And what you're seeing here is a to scale maquette that the artist studio put together, in which they replicated the gallery in the space, and then they kind of played around with fabric and folding the fabric in different ways to, think about what kind of a shape they would want to make within our space. And here's another view of that. And it was, it's what's really funny is that in a way, I can see this as it manifested. I mean, it seems so simple here, right? And it's like a crude clay sculpture or something, but it is this little fabric model that they created, in which, they very much planned directly from.
I mean, you say that it seems so simple here, and maybe it seems simple because it's smaller.
Right.
But I think that, when we look at something like this sewing plan, the technical specifications of just physically handling so much material,
Yeah.
and kind of working through the interplay between the fabric and the weight of the paint and the weight of the water that was diluting the acrylic paint.
Mhm. Mhm.
Meant for a pretty complex, almost, rigging system.
That's right. Yeah, there are a lot of technical aspects, and I will just say I mentioned that the gallery is about 2,300 square feet. The sheet of fabric that was stitched together in that gallery is more than 50,000 square feet, which
Wow.
I think, okay, I'm really bad at my football statistics, but I think that's about the size of a football field, perhaps without the end zones. But, right, that's it's about 57,000 square feet, I think, is a football field.
Yeah. Well, and we can imagine kind of just the effort of stitching this all together. I mean, we've got this image here of a pretty heavy duty sewing machine. And Virginia, can you tell us a little bit more about what this actually looked like in production?
Sure, sure. So we ordered with the artist specifications, and I should note that there were multiple Skype meetings and planning sessions involved in this. And we ordered 15 bolts of fabric that were about 5 by 60 meters in size. And then those bolts of fabric were stitched together in the gallery. And what you're seeing here is artist David Page, who we hired to really do the stitching. He's an expert in fabric sculpting. And so he brought his industrial machine here. And we had a team of, if you go to the next, there we go, image. We had a team of BMA staff and volunteers who worked on site. And you can see that they really have to hold the fabric and help it move through, right? People are supporting it on one side and pulling it through on the other to move it through the machine. And as you might imagine, as the sheet gets bigger and bigger and bigger, that process got more and more challenging.
Mm-hmm.
And there you can see sort of the resulting ocean of fabric that is produced. And I should also note that the gallery itself was lined at this point with plastic sheeting. And you can see there are various rigging points that had already been suspended from the trussed ceiling.
So, I mean, in kind of getting this behind the scenes look, you can see how there's the fabric is being lifted. You can imagine this team of people in the front, this trio, hauling with all their body weight against the rope to be able to lift the sheet of fabric.
That's right. There were 14 pre-designated points on that map that you showed us earlier. And in each of those pre-designated points, there was a little flag that was sewn into this ocean of fabric. And so the studio team, by keeping an eye on where those flags were, knotted the fabric at those points and then attached those to the 14 rigging points to suspend them from the ceiling. So yeah, it was very labor intensive, this process.
And so
there you can see for some of those 14 points.
I'm curious about sort of the artist's perspective on this. We talked a little bit about it in our pre-interview, but does she view this entire process as art making or as sort of the mark making aspect, which I know we're going to get to, but I'm just curious about, this feels very much like, it's almost conceptual art in some respects. And there are a lot of hands at play, which I really love because we think about art being often being made by the singular genius. In this case, we see that that's an impossibility. The sheer amount of fabric and the work that goes into this requires a lot of specialists and time. So I'm curious about the artist's perspective on sort of what is the work of art ultimately.
Yeah, I think that's a wonderful question. No doubt the finished piece really is officially the work of art. But I think you're right, Addie, to point out the conceptual aspect of that. And, Katerina is very clear in acknowledging the team and acknowledging the collaborative nature of the production of the work of art. And in really, she articulates, that it's about responding to a set of givens. And those givens might include, obviously, the space that the work is going into. It's the team of people that she's working with. It's the, cultural and civic context of the installation, and including the machine and the spray gun itself, the compressor, the equipment, all of those factors tie together for her in the making and in the production of the work of art.
And I love sort of that she's using this sort of industrial spray gun. It really a lot of her work really recalls for me a variety of artists. You know, I think about sort of these sort of female artists across time who have explored mark making in a variety of ways, like Helen Frankenthaler with her pouring paint on surfaces and allowing gravity to kind of mix and mingle those paints together. And then someone like Judy Chicago, who herself was sort of taking auto body spray painting classes and using sort of these mechanical processes to create marks. And I'm really so curious about Gross's like sort of how she's sort of extending that language of mark making in her works of art from your perspective.
Yeah, I think that's great. I will note that this photo depicts her studio assistant, Darren, who was, you know, very much present and active. The paint is mixed up in these huge gallons, thinned out with water, and then run through the compressor. So again, it's, you know, it's even the painting is a team effort. Right. So as far as process goes too, I mean, I think that's exactly right. We all sort of associate, you know, abstract painting and artists like Jackson Pollock, for example, or, you know, Richard Serra, who's flinging lead to create sculpture around a gallery space. I even think about someone like the artist Nikki de Saint-Val, who would shoot paintings, right? Embed paint in plaster and then shoot at the paintings. But there's a very you know, a long and wonderfully rich, complex genealogy of artists experimenting with paint. And in Gross's case, that also includes the use of stencils and blocking, thinking about the way the paint falls across a surface, which you very much see at play here.
Yeah, well, and also thinking, I mean, this reminds me also of Linda Benglis's poured latex pieces, where I think for me, one of the things that comes up is that this is really the question of how do you make color take different forms, and really open up the possibility of color as a space of imagination, and kind of flexibility, and sort of thinking about the world otherwise.
Yes, that's true. I think for, you know, for Katerina's perspective, she very much embraces an abstract language because of that, because of the sort of freedom of interpretation, the openness of interpretation. And for an installation like this, the fact that it is immersive and that you have to enter it in, and I think you can see from this photo, it's almost a kind of U shape. So in order to see the whole thing, you really do have to enter it and walk around and explore in order to kind of see every side of it. And she very directly will connect that to a kind of, you know, an awareness of the way in which we move through space, an awareness of the impact of our decisions and our choices on the world around us.
I loved visiting, but I also felt like I was doing something subversive by, you know, walking not only into what felt like initially sort of a Sam Gilliam-esque like painting, right? But then feeling like I'm standing on a painting felt somehow very wrong.
Yeah.
Also very right.
Impressive. Yes. Well, and as you can see, we developed some signage, and this is our pre-coronavirus signage, I will note. But we did develop some language with the artist in terms of, you know, how can we encourage people to take that kind of transgressive action in the context of a museum where we're always telling people, don't touch, you know, whatever you do, don't touch the art. In her previous installations, one was in a kind of theater, public arts building and fabric installations. And the other one was in a space in a kind of commercial shopping center in Shanghai. And so this was the first time that she'd really produced one of these in, you know, a traditional fine arts museum. So it was really fun kind of working through both the process of production and thinking through the reception of the work and public interaction with it in that context.
And I think one thing that, you know, you can start to get a sense of is that this piece will change over time. And it was designed to, I think in some way, sort of remain site-specific over the course of its existence, in that as people move across it, as the sort of puddles of fabric on the floor get moved around and shifted, the painting will open up. You know, it will get worn away. You will see the canvas that was untouched by the spray gun paint. And so, you know, I think in a way there is meant to be a sort of lifespan of the work. And I think that that's something that is another sort of environmental parameter that Grossa sets for herself.
Yeah, I like that, Veronica. I think, you know, bringing it back to Addie's sense of a landscape too, right? We can almost think of it too as evolving over the course of time, and changing a little bit in that sense. So that, yes, you're right, the fabric flattens, and it does record both through the process of its own making, the layering of paint, the puddling of paint, and so on, and this sense of the fabric itself moving and changing over time a little bit. It gives us that sense, yeah.
I also think it gives us this real, there's this real privilege of having this moment in time in this space with this particular object. And I think a lot of questions always surface about sort of these temporal works and what happens to them when they're finished, when they're finished on view. And I'm curious if you could tell us a little bit more about that.
Mm-hmm. Sure. Well, she has traveled these installations before. I mentioned the one that she had done in Shanghai that later traveled to a space in Guangzhou. And, you know, you can think about it also as in terms of site specificity, that obviously no two galleries will be exactly the same. No two spaces will be exactly the same. So this would be taken down and then, you know, intentionally reconfigured in a space that might be smaller, that might be, you know, lower in ceiling, might be a longer, narrower space. So she does consider maybe a secondary life for these pieces one way or the other.
Well, I'm going to bring us back on screen since we're kind of, you know, thinking about secondary life and kind of what comes next. I thought I would take this moment to transition into what comes next on this show, which is
the here and now, Veronica.
The here and now that finds us in this digital moment. Virginia, I want to thank you for taking us through some of Gross's conceptual concerns, how this manifests in an incredibly sort of physically lush and enveloping kind of painting that you can step into, and a space that is meant to be, as Addie pointed out, a little bit transgressive, which is really kind of a break from some of our standard museum experiences. So thank you.
Thank you for your time, Virginia.
Thank you very much
for having
me, for letting me join you
absolutely.
and talk about this wonderful piece, which I just love so much.
Thank you so much.
It's pretty stunning. So if folks are able to make it when the Baltimore Museum of Art reopens, when it's safe to,
we would love to have you.
We would love to have you. Absolutely.
Yeah.
So thanks again, Virginia.
Thanks, Virginia.
Take you off, and Addie, if you would.
Yeah, sure. I'm
part two.
Yeah, excited to introduce our next site-specific artist. Mary Evans is a UK-based artist, and she's here today to discuss her ephemeral site-specific silhouettes. Her works often reference historical events, including the Atlantic slave trade and enslaved labor, and their impact on contemporary culture. She received a number of significant commissions, awards, and residencies, including the Smithsonian Artists Research Fellowship at the National Museum of African Art here in Washington, D.C. in 2010. Her work has been exhibited extensively internationally and even at the BMA, which we'll probably have a chance to talk about today. So I just want to welcome Mary and thank her for calling in from the UK. Thanks, Mary. Welcome.
Hello, everyone. Hi, Veronica. Hi.
Hi.
It's so good to have you join us, Mary.
Oh, I'm happy to be here. It's great.
Yeah. So, Mary,
Sorry. Just,
yeah, no, go ahead.
Listening about Catalina Gross's work, and so she's shown at BMA, so have I. She's shown in Guangzhou, so have I. Miko Hood took those images, and he took images of my work, and I was just really connecting with her practice. It's great.
Oh, that's fantastic.
Yeah, that's so great. Well, I know that I wanted to just sort of contextualize things and share that the work that was at the museum, at the Women's Museum on view, is called Prospect, and we do have an image of that. And then what I'd like to do is actually kind of dig in a little bit too. So this is just one installation shot of the work that we'll sort of come back to. But I wanted to talk a little bit, Mary, about sort of what got you to this point with these craft paper silhouettes. And you had originally studied paintings. My my understanding, but you said that no canvas was quite large enough for the work you wanted to do. So I'm hoping you can tell us a little bit about sort of how you evolved from sort of painting to the work that you're doing now, like this one we see.
Sure. On my undergraduate course, BA Fine Art, I was a painter. I always think that art students often start as painters before they kind of move into other areas. I did a course in London at Chelsea College of Art, and a lot of our first years, start the course as painters. So I was a painter for a long time before this work kind of evolved. But I was always very interested in painting objects and things that I found around, just whatever, bowls of fruit, things that you might consider to be still life type objects, but also just things that we would have at home. So they weren't necessarily always maybe conventional European type things, like my parents had Nigerian masks or drums as ornaments, and those are the kind of things that I would paint. But I nearly always painted them floating around in midair. So I had this thing of, I didn't really want them to be still live, but so I didn't want to paint the tabletop, so they were always floating around. And then I did that through BA and MA, and then I went on to Amsterdam and I did a kind of post-MA, postgraduate 2-year period in the Rights Academy. And I continued working with these kinds of objects, but my interest at that time had evolved into a pictographic language. One of my tutors gave me this incredible folder of pictographic images that we're all very familiar with, I'm sure, the kind of airport and train station images to guide you to the counter, to get you to the bathroom, that kind of thing. So the objects I was painting became more streamlined and more pictographic, but there were still objects. And I used to paint in a way that I like to refer to as offset. So I would make paintings by cutting out stencils and masks, but not really directly dipping a paintbrush in paint and painting on canvas. I would cut a shape out of, I think there were some images that I sent that, like, for instance, scissors, or always a formal, here we go, a formal play in what the image was. Is it a pair of scissors? Is it a bunch of cherries? Is it a house? Is it a computer? Is it a boat? It was always a very formal interplay. But all those images that you see there were cut out of plastic and a knife stuck onto the canvas, painted over, and then peeled off. And I would peel these marks off and for some reason keep them. I didn't want to throw them away. Something told me to hang on to them. And I think there's an image of them stuck onto a wall. These in Amsterdam in the Rights Academy, I kept them. So these are kind of the detritus of my painting practice that I didn't want to throw away, but I didn't really know what to do with them. My paintings, my actual canvases were getting bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger, to the point where I had to dismantle them to get them into that space and put them back together again, because I just stopped. I didn't want to see the edge of the canvas. So actually, I'm making it sound as though this happened overnight, but it didn't. Over a period of about a year, I suppose. But I kind of jettisoned the canvas completely, and I would move these shapes. These are the plastic shapes that come off paintings, move them around the wall. And but they weren't that great. They didn't stick that well. They'd fall off. And I eventually stumbled across brown paper, just regular old brown paper that we used, to wrap parcels. And so this was one of the very first ones that I made. And I found that wet brown paper, cut with a knife and a ruler, very sharp, very precise, to make these pictographic images, and stuck onto the wall with paste, with wallpaper paste, which, just a household material. The images fused very, very well to the wall. They were as permanent or impermanent as any wallpaper in your home might be. So that became my kind of methodology, my process matured in Amsterdam at the Rights Academy, because I had lots of time and space to develop my work. One of the reasons I went there, because in London I always had to have a job, and I had funding, I had fantastic studio access, so the work really developed there.
So, Mary, something that sticks out to me in looking at this shift from canvas to wall is that you talk about the edge of the canvas bothering you, and sort of, it was never big enough. And I'm curious, do you have that sort of relationship between edge and ground or sort of the surface of the wall? Like, is any wall ever big enough, or do you feel like it's already enough of an extensive and sort of encompassing space that you don't have that same sense of limitation?
Yeah, that's really interesting, actually, because I feel now, well, for the last 20 or so years, I will work with whatever the parameters of the space are. So if it's small, then that's what I'll work with. If they're very large, then that's what I'll work with. And if it's wall, that's what I'll work with. If it's glass, that's what I'll work with. So very much about whatever qualities or properties the space offers, I will navigate them. So I don't have the same issues about the frame of a space as I used to when I was making canvases. So I'll work within the architecture. So this was at BMA in 2008, and it was I had carte blanche there too. It was meditations on pattern, and Karen Milbourne said, "Oh, you can do whatever you want, wherever you want to do it." And oh, these windows, yeah, I'll do that as well as the gallery space. And for me, the glass surface just offered new opportunities for me to expand the practice in a different material, which for me is a way of progressing with my work. You know, you might get thrown challenges, whether it's scale or whether it's surface, but then finding a way around it is, for me, part of the work, part of the challenge of the work. So that's, yeah.
I love, Mary, that you started out really focusing on objects, and you've kind of gone in the opposite direction. You're really focused now primarily on figures. And we talked a little bit about sort of what that source material is, because that's always a question that I have. And you shared some images, if you want to talk a little bit about like sort of where these silhouettes sort of come from. And then we can talk a little bit more about how they interact with one another when we take a look at Prospect.
Well, I trawl the internet basically for images of naked people. That sounds terrible, doesn't it? But,
I don't think you're alone, Mary.
That's what I do, and with some caveats, you know. But as a rule, I try to find images that are kind of source material for artists of the human form. I used to work in an art store when I was a student, and we used to sell, at the time, you know, when people used to buy those kind of books, we used to sell books that were, I think they were called something like Artist Figure Referencing Manual and that kind of thing, used by artists and graphic designers and that kind of thing. And then I wasn't really working with this kind of imagery at the time, but I was still fascinated by those books. I used to photocopy them like crazy as a kind of library, and that's when that library started for me. That kind of, I started to build this image bank. But now it's so much easier to just go on Google and find things, and there's some examples here of the kind of things that I've found. And I will generally find an image. I won't necessarily, sometimes I'll go and look for specific images. If I'm thinking of a particular pose that I'm trying to find, I won't always find it. But every now and then, in kind of down times between shows, I try to be prepared and just add to my image bank. So I'll just find something, they're usually color, and then I'll just, you know, in settings, in preview or Photoshop or something, just turn them into black and white, mess around with the contrast, because all I'm interested in is the form, turn them into silhouettes. Sometimes it's hard depending on what kind of background the image is in. So the one on the top left, for instance, it's got all that greenery in the background. So for a figure like that, I would just cut that figure out completely out of its background with a knife, and I would color it in with a black marker pen, and then I would photocopy. So I would make them into silhouettes, and then I can start to work out how they're going to go together, what kind of relationships I'm going to make with figures and scale and that kind of thing. And also, I suppose I should mention here that, as you can see here, I think maybe all these figures are of white people. So I will reconfigure. I will use hairstyle. I would slightly change some bodily features, facial features, that kind of thing, because I want my figures to be approximations of African people.
Yeah. And then the next image we have, I think, shows us a little bit of an inside peek in the space that you use.
So my current studio, which when I'm working, when I'm busy in the middle of making something, it's an absolute mess. And what I always find quite interesting about it is that I do some other work sometimes, which it does involve a little bit of paint and a little bit of ink. And what I will do when I do that work is I will get a great big long sheet of brown paper and put it on the floor, just so that I don't get the studio floor completely messy. But it's the same material that I used to make my work. So sometimes I laugh when I think, oh, that's just newspaper at the moment covering the floor. But on another day, that's actually the material that I used to make my work, so it kind of fluctuates between the two. And that's my cutting table. So I have a large surface. It's a door that I have covered in. I've stuck down lots of green cutting mats on it, and it's just about 2 meters. So I can get a full length figure, like a 6'2" male figure will sit on there, and I can cut it out in one go.
And I think you've just made an important point about scale. If we take a look at product, which was on view during our Paper Roots exhibition at the Women's Museum, we get a sense of this is sort of a full wall that's covered. It's populated by these figures. And this is one of the works, you said during our pre-interview that this may be one of the only works that you've incorporated an object in with all of your figures. And in this particular case, you've actually incorporated an image of the White House, which you personally took when you were here on your fellowship at the Smithsonian. I'm curious, Mary, if you can talk a little bit more about sort of why the White House, why now, why at the Women's Museum in this particular moment in time?
Well, when in 2010, I was a research fellow at the Smithsonian, the Museum of African Art. I was there for about 2.5 months, and I was just kind of making work. I had a small space and interacting with the collection, etc. And I just absolutely loved being in Washington, D.C. And I used to go to the Women's Museum. I used to go and visit it and see shows. And so when I was invited to take part in Paper Roots, I was really excited. At the time, we thought we were all going to be able to go there. So I was like, oh, I'm going to DC. Oh, I love DC. So when I was planning this work, I just felt as though I needed to, one thing I try to do as much as I possibly can, it doesn't always work out, is the work is site specific, but I often like it to be kind of culturally specific or socially specific or politically specific as well. So to have some kind of connection with the site, the place, the history of the place, the city, whatever it might be. So I felt as though I couldn't have an exhibition in Washington, D.C. in a museum that was a few blocks away without referencing the White House in some way. And I had these images of the White House that I took when I used to go and visit, just as a tourist in 2010. So it was important for them to be there, but also in terms of this particular, in my work, I don't often have, other than the figures and the relationships that are made between the figures, there aren't often other clues or other things to go on. So it was partly that, and also to feed into what I understand to be kind of the perceived narrative that enslaved Africans built the White House or one of the White Houses, whichever one didn't burn down. I'm not quite sure. I don't know my American history all that well. And I wanted to have these figures interact with that place. And also, I'm interested in history in my practice. If I hadn't been an artist, I would have studied history at university instead of art. And I'm interested in the collapse of the historical and the contemporaneous and how they can kind of come together. And it can span 200 years, it can span 50 years, but there's often a connection kind of across the years in the work. And so everything that's been going on all over the world, but I'm specifically thinking about the US and the UK last summer in terms of Black Lives Matter and protests and COVID-19 and all this. So for me was kind of, it was important to have that connection with politics and with place in the work.
Yeah, well, and Mary, because of the historical moment that we're in, it's hard to see the White House and not consider it as a place of congregation, whether for Oh, for any range of politically charged purposes. And so, you know, thinking about it as a site that has been a focal point for so many groups for its symbolic charge. You know, I think it's interesting to consider the experience of standing in the room in front of Prospect with, you know, some of these life-size silhouettes among you, and thinking of yourself as sort of potentially a member of this group and of this gathering. And I'm sort of curious how you think about that visitor experience of being sort of a part of that group.
Yeah, it's really important to me that the viewer practically feels as though they can step into the work and be there. So that's why the figures are life-size. You know, the tallest male figures are about 6'3". The tallest female figures are about 5'8", 9". And you can stand there and kind of identify quite directly in a physical sense, in terms of scale, but I'm hoping also in a kind of metaphorical sense in terms of the symbolism of what's going on. Talking about iconic images, the White House is an iconic image, but I consider my figures to be kind of iconic ciphers in a way. I'm reminded of W.E.B. Du Bois's Souls of Black Folk. You know, I consider my figures to be the souls of Black folk. You know, they might be walking amongst the dead, they might be walking amongst the living. You know, that image that you've got there of the raised fist, you know, John Carlos in 1968, Mexico City Olympics, or it could be a protester from last summer, Black Lives Matter in Washington, D.C. or London, you know. So it's, I feel as though people standing in front of the work might have done that last summer themselves. They might have raised their fist in kind of frustration and defiance and annoyance. And so I want to have that direct relationship with the viewer, and for you to feel as though you can walk in. I had a piece of work a few years ago that was called Held. And for me, the influence was that the work held you. It held you there in your tracks. You know, you were held as part of the work.
Well, I really appreciate that these work feel, as you're saying, sort of in some respects very universal, but also very individual or very personal. And I know, Mary, we talked that sort of there's some bit of autobiography as well as sort of cultural history in your works. And I'm hoping you can tell us a little bit more about sort of how you see yourself reflected in these works, or how you pour yourself into these works.
Yeah, well, I'm interested in a pictographic universal language, but I think that it can be used to tell certain aspects of personal stories as well, which don't have to be particularly specific either. And also they can be, you know, a personal story can be universal at the same time. So for instance, there was an image of somebody with a hand held out to a baby.
Oh, so, yes, here we are.
Yeah, just feeding a small child, or the child to the left mimicking perhaps its father, with, you know, trying to raise its fist also. And when I'm one of 6 girls growing up in northwest London, and you know, a family ritual every morning was getting our hair done for school, you know, and lots of African American and African British people will well, you don't have to be African, actually. Just getting your hair done by your mum before you go to school is quite a universal little tableau, I think. Yeah, there you go.
Yeah, there we are.
Little things like that, you know. Because we were a large family of girls, you know, there might be saying, my mum doing my hair, while she's doing my hair, I'm doing my sister's hair, and she's doing another sister's hair. You know what I mean? There'd be like this chain of women and young girls doing each other's hair, getting ready for school. You know, this is like 8:15 in the morning. So I'm interested in telling these very little, quite incidental stories as simply as possible. I like to think of the work as, or the imagery as, simple but not simplistic. You know, simple in terms of pictographic and getting the image across, but being quite loaded in its simplicity, if you see what I mean.
Well, and I think that, you know, to return to your conceptualization of these silhouettes as souls, as the souls of Black folks. There's a certain kind of almost timeless, but also eternally contemporary quality to them, in that these are people engaging in human relationships, you know, and they are in some cases autobiographical for you, but in other cases, you know, biographical for somebody else.
Yeah.
And I think that focus on both a deep sense of humanity as well as recasting African figures or figures of African descent as universal is something that is a really significant political move in your work. Because, you know, going back to the source images that you pulled, where for advertisements, everybody's white, there is a shifting of the standard and a shifting of what it is to create a universal or in some aspects universal experience.
Yeah. That's really interesting and important, I think, for me in my practice, because to me, you know, African figures they're not incidental. They are pretty standard, and they are my standard reality. That's what I've grown up with, and so it's important that that they can be seen as the lowest common denominator in a way that we're not, in generally speaking, in advertising and okay, I know things have changed in the last 50 or so years, but still, I made something similar to this in Ireland in 2016, so nearly 5 years ago, and my figures were the same figures that you see here. The narratives and configurations were a little bit different, but I was very much thinking about the Irish diaspora. I grew up in Northwest London amongst lots of Irish people, and a lot of diasporic stories are connected and are similar. And I'm thinking about British, you know, in terms of British colonialism, and even though the work. It was called Thousands of Sailing, and it was about, at the time, it was very much steeped in the current, at the time, refugee crisis. So I had lines and queues of people queuing up to go away, to go abroad. So it was Irish people queuing up to travel to the United States during the potato famine, or Syrians queuing up to get to Fortress Europe. And they're so connected and so the same. And for me, this divisiveness is something that I'm really kind of against in terms of in relation to my work. I'm more into showing how similar we are rather than how different we are, you know, through the work.
And I think that focus on movement and migration is something that really does tie a lot of people together, you know, whether that is voluntary or forced migration. And you know, along with that, one of the things that I've seen you mention is kind of your interest in things that are ephemeral. And so much like somebody asked if the Catarina Grossa, is it you, is permanent, I'm sort of curious to hear from you how you think about the duration of your work.
Yeah, that's an interesting question, Veronica, and something that people get quite upset with me sometimes. Because so what? Yeah, it's over. You know, scrape it off, put it in the recycling. It started as recycling, it ends up back to recycling paper again. But for me, it's a few things. It's to do with I use cheap disposable materials to comment on the cheap and disposable way African lives have. It's a direct correlation, I think, between African bodies being shipped and I use material that is used for shipping and sending and that kind of thing, and also the disposability. I think it's partly to do with the reaction from being a painter for so many years, where you just have to have all this stuff in your studio. You've got to have loads of wood and stretchers and canvas and paint and bottles and jars. And, oh my God. And there's no way to make me work.
It's very heavy.
When I stopped painting, I felt this incredible yoke, in a way, fall off my shoulders. Because if somebody doesn't see the work, see a show or come to my studio, they don't really see anything. They won't see anything. When they come to my studio, they'll just see rolls of paper and some test pieces. You know, my studio is not gigantic, so you'll see some test pieces on the wall. So the work is really experiential. You really have to experience it. But it's also, there's also, for me, the installation of the work is also experiential, because I had to for prospect because of the coronavirus, but normally I don't plan. I'll plan a general, I want to have, I don't know, 60 different kinds of figures or a certain range of scales. But then it's not until I'm in the space, in front of the wall, that I decide what's going to go where. So there is I feel as though I can always make it again. So, but I don't really, because I wouldn't make prospect somewhere else, because for that museum, that space, that time, now, it wouldn't make sense doing it somewhere in London. I might make something similar, but it would have to have different connotations. There'd be a different history, a different story, a different narrative behind it. You see what I mean? So as far as I'm concerned, I can always make things again. And I have done a few times in the past, remade, even though it might be considered the same, it might have the same title, it will always be different if I remake it, because the space will be quite different and that kind of thing.
Mary, I could talk to you all day.
I could sit here the rest of the evening.
I wanted to mention, for those of us, I didn't see any questions unless some have come in more recently. I wanted to mention, though, that our digital team was working late into the night to get your studio, your virtual studio visit on our website. So if folks want to hear more and see you in your studio space, those are now, that video is now available. So again, thank you for doing that. What seemed like a million years ago, but yeah. So if anyone wants to see that, if they go to NMWA.org and then /W2W, the number 2, then we do have a bunch of video assets, including an extended conversation with Mary. And I wanted to thank you again for your time across time zones and the work that you do. We appreciate the work that you do.
It's interesting to think about being figures sort of in a vacuum, as we have been in our digital realm for so long. Just these floating heads in boxes.
I think that might be a way to go for me. Maybe after this is all over, I might end up making little boxes of profile heads, and as the next piece of work or something. I don't know. We'll see. I just want to say how amazing the technical staff at the museum were putting up the work, because I think I said to you in our pre-chat last week, I very meticulously made what's it called, Illustrator file, and slightly grudgingly had to decide where everything was going to go, because I just cannot bear doing it, but I have to do it, obviously, for obvious reasons, and having to decide way ahead of time what was going to go where. Anyway, sent it all off and with lots of instructions and say, Zoom me if there's any problems. I know it's all up and it's all done. I'm like, oh my God, they just did it. What I think is amazing about it is that this current time, I've learned during this coronavirus that I can do that. So I can hand over. I think there was a question in the previous discussion about, where the work, kind of ownership and authorship and that kind of thing. And I think that I can let go of some of my control freakery, knowing that we can do it. It's possible,
Well, thank you for that. Thank you for that nod to Greg and our, registrar installation team. And in a way, I was, thinking about how, artists like conceptual artists like Saul LeWitt would provide some set of instructions. I feel like maybe this is a new realm for you, Mary. Maybe there's new opportunities for you.
It is, and of course I've got those instructions. I'll keep them for next time, because you never know. So yeah, they were just brilliant. Yeah, really good.
Well, thank you so much again for your time today, and thank you for joining us. And we're doing this again next month. Our topic will be youth, and we'll have a special guest photographer, Rania Matar, speaking about her work. And just want to thank you all.
Yes. So thank you everyone for being with us here and now, wherever here and now may be for you. And we look forward to having you join us again in February. So thanks again, Mary. It's been such a pleasure.
Thanks very much for having me.
Here, Mary. Bye, everyone.
Bye, everybody.